Sylvia and me.
Sylvia and
Sylvia and me. Sylvia and
Sylvia. Sylvia and me.
For a few partial seconds, we stand in the dark at what feels like the edge of the world as it comes alive with the breathing of 1,472 theater goers, the rhythm of their anticipation lapping toward us in oncoming waves. People come to Broadway ready to engage, hoping the music and the story will give them what their hearts are reaching for. But what they don't know is that our hearts are reaching too, and the wall that separates us is only imaginary from their side. For us, this story and this moment with them is in real time.
Hi, I'm Sylvia Beckerman, host of the podcast series Sylvia and Me. Conversations with inspiring, empowering women.
My name is Christine Barker, and I am thrilled to be here with Sylvia and me to have the opportunity to talk about my book, Third Girl from the Left. It's an account of what I witnessed backstage and on Broadway and in New York City hospitals during a time at the onset of the AIDS epidemic. I had been a young girl who came to New York, who lived at the Salvation Army, and made my way through a very competitive and mostly heartbreaking career, facing failure after failure. And I finally had my dream. I got into the cast of a chorus line. I opened it in London, and then I joined the New York Broadway cast. But unfortunately, it was right at the same time in the early 1980s at the onset of the AIDS epidemic. So my book is the story about what life was like for me as this young woman who had achieved her dream. And then when the world began to collapse for reasons that were totally beyond my control, there was very little information about the AIDS epidemic, and those of us that were tasked with taking care of our friends and our family had almost nowhere to go. So my book is really about a young woman making impossible choices about her career, about her brother's life, about other people's lives during a time of crisis. I'm happy to see you, Sylvia. Thank you for having me.
Christine, welcome. I am so pleased that you were able to make it here with me today, because what you've just talked about is there are so many different facets of it. And the first facet I want to talk about is you and how you grew up and your passion for dancing and how you were able to accomplish that. And I know that you grew up in a family. You are one of 6 children. Your father was an aviator and commander in the U.S. Navy. And so growing up until high school, you actually lived in a variety of different places, because wherever he was posted, you picked up and you left. And when you were in high school, about to go to high school, your father retired and you moved to Santa Fe, where a lot of your ancestors, a lot of your relatives had called home. And, one of the things that surprised me is you talked about how difficult it was, picking up each time. And after 2 or 3 years, you have to make new friends and you go to new places. Yet when you moved to Santa Fe on a permanent basis, that was almost more difficult for you.
It absolutely was. And you really do have it correctly. I think that a lot of people do not understand a military life. They think about the military soldier, the mother now, or mostly in my days, the father, and a little is really written and talked about the dependents and the children of military in military families. So yes, I moved every 2.5 to 3 years. By the time I got to high school, I'd gone to 8 different schools. I'd lived across the United States and I'd lived in Europe. So on the one hand, it's very disorienting because you're only in a place for so long. And so you kind of learn to plug in and to plug in hard. And if it's not a good place, or you feel like you don't fit in, or for some reason something is off at this school, you also know it isn't forever. So you live with this kind of dynamic right? But you also live with this necessity to adapt and to be able to read the room, be able to read people, to be able to read what's going on around you, because it's very different. It's very different from city to city in the United States, and then to also be in Europe. So I think I learned a great deal about adaptability. But I also had from my father, that I think he actually had from his ancestors in the West. My grandmother, my great grandmother, my great grandfather, they were pioneers. They were there on the wagon trains practically, and they settled in New Mexico at the end of the 1870s. And so if you are from the West like I am, your history is very present in you. My parents talked about my grandparents and great grandparents as if they were almost in the present tense. Well, Nana did this, or my grandfather did that. And you realize the drive and the will and the devotion that these people had to creating lives, to creating good lives. So there was an enormous amount of drive and determination from my father, and dedication to his country and to his family and to his community. So throughout everything, you had these values that were very strong. And they had also been very strong in my ancestors, because that's what their survival depended upon, right? So I think that there was just so much of that flowing through my blood, that when it came time to think, okay, I really want to be a dancer, I really want to have this dream, you know, the most natural thing seemed to do to pack my bag and go. Now, of course, my parents were terrified and thinking, oh my God, she's going to New York, the terrible, frightening city. And how is she going to do this? And it was a very difficult transition for my father, moving from the military to private life. And it coincided with my two older siblings going off to college. And then there was a little bit of a gap, but then me. But, we didn't have a lot of money. So, it was a stage door story. I had $500 in my sneaker, and I went.
Well, you mentioned where you lived in New York, but I know that the first place your mother thought was the safest was the Barbizon Hotel. And back in the day, that's where the women went. That's where everyone sent their daughters to become secretaries or actresses or whatever, and then to go find a husband. And by the time you went there, it was expensive. It was run down. So you stayed one night. And then as you said, you wound up at the Salvation Army Evangeline Home for Girls. We don't
Right.
want people to think that you just went to the Salvation Army and,
Right. No, it was a 13-story building, and I lived in a dormitory. $45 a week. Can
well,
you
there you
believe that?
go.
There you go.
And you studied with Alvin Ailey, Luigi at the American Ballet Theater. You eventually did summer stock. I mean, I believe your father had given you just so much, and you had a supplement, and you weren't going back home. You were going to prove that this is what you wanted to do, and therefore you're going to make it. And you pushed yourself, and you did, as I said, summer stock, dinner theater, national tours. You danced along with Tommy Tune.
Yes.
You met Michael Bennett, and then you were hired for the London production of A Chorus Line.
Right.
And from there, you went to Broadway.
Mhm.
Now, what I'd really like, as I asked you before, I'd like you to read the prologue to your book, because as someone who goes to musicals, who goes to plays, especially musicals where you're dancing and you're spending, I mean, you're doing this not just the night that I'm going or someone's going. And people, I don't think, understand the whole it's not a community, but what you live through in doing this 8 times a week. So if I could ask you to read the prologue, I think it tells so much about this part of the industry and a huge part of your life.
All right. 8 times a week, as the house lights go out, the stage manager calls, "Places," and we run from the theater's wings in single lines, holding hands through space so thick I can't see in front of me. A tiny white signal, the orchestra conductor's baton, floats at a distant point like a speck of phosphorus on a midnight sea. Those of us in the front line use it or the red exit signs at the back of the house to navigate our way. Each of us has a spot, a nearly invisible small mark on the stage floor. And once we find it, we drop hands and freeze, feet together, arms at our sides. Sometimes I think I might burst with the pressure and the terrible aloneness. My feet pressed to my mark, my hands so cold I can't feel them. For a few partial seconds, we stand in the dark at what feels like the edge of the world as it comes alive with the breathing of 1,472 theater goers, the rhythm of their anticipation lapping toward us in oncoming waves. People come to Broadway ready to engage, hoping the music and the story will give them what their hearts are reaching for. But what they don't know is that our hearts are reaching too, and the wall that separates us is only imaginary from their side. For us, this story and this moment with them is in real time. Thankfully, it's less than a minute before the downbeat starts, and then there is no more thinking or holding back, only the relief of sudden light and music, a warmth and a sound we have absorbed so thoroughly they've become our sun and our air. With the music in us, it's our job to translate it with every spinning step or hurtling leap, so someone sitting in the orchestra or balcony can feel its power too. We on the stage are attuned to the audience, the subtle differences between those attending a matinee or an evening show, a Saturday or a Tuesday night. We listen for what stirs their sensibilities, a single quick intake of breath, the rustle of embarrassment, or a hush so desperate it beats with an almost audible pulse. From the deep privacy of their seats, the audience engages unselfconsciously, as if we are figments inside their heads, singing in a language akin to prayer. Some people go to church to experience grace, and others go to the theater.
And I think that says so much. That's why I wanted you to read it, because it really is the essence of what a performer does. And you did this 8 days a week for quite a long time. And we don't think about life like that. We don't really, you go to one show and you think, okay, they're acting. But as you said, you're attuned to the audience. So every time you perform, it's a little bit different, although no one would really, other than the performers, know that. And that talks a lot about life, because as we go through life, we have to adapt to what happens on a regular basis.
Yes.
I
So
want to,
I'm
yes,
sorry,
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
No,
Sorry,
no, you.
Okay. So from a performer's perspective, and this is something that I really wanted to tell, it's an enormously personal experience. You cannot do a show like a chorus line. And of course, shows are different, but chorus line, which was dealing with a sense of growing up and humanity and who we are and trying to figure out what we're going to become. That was the nature of the show. Everybody having a dream. It's such a personal experience, and to convey it personally as if you're just there. I mean, you're lined up on a line with just leotard and tights, very, exposing. You have to reach out and be truthful and be vulnerable in that moment. And that's what an audience responds to, because it's a communication, and you establish an intimacy. So what you talked about too is that everybody who's going to the show, they're there and they're in their seat, and yes, they're seeing it, and then they're going to go home. but we on the stage are doing it 8 times a week. Yes, but every time is important because every time is an intimate experience. And most people who go away, especially if a show is really, really good, which a chorus line is, it lives with them and they think about it or they talk about it or whatnot. But there's something there that it has been a connection. And to me, this is the ultimate in art and in life. It's connection.
It's connection. Connection is so important. And I'd like to bring in your brother, Laughlin, who
Mm-hmm,
was an attorney.
mm-hmm.
He had been married. He moved to New York. Tell me about your relationship with your brother and before anything, when he first moved to New York.
Okay. Yes. So because we moved around so much, and there were 6 children in my family and kind of, spread out. So, we were over a couple of generations in a way. I was very close to my siblings because even if you knew nobody in the playground, you did at least have maybe a brother who was there, or a sister, right? Although I had 4 brothers and just 1 sister. So as a sibling group, we were very close, and we relied on each other. And we grew up having to rely on each other. So I was lucky enough that I had an older brother and an older sister who were just that much older than I was. And they seemed, of course, very powerful and very wise and very smart, and that they knew everything about the world. So I grew up already having that sense. So when I went off to New York, it was kind of this wild thing. My brother was older. He had to serve in the military. Otherwise, he would have been drafted for the Vietnam War. So he served in the military. And then when he came back, he married one of his best friends and he went back to school, to Georgetown, to law school. But he really came to the conclusion that he was a gay man and that this wasn't fair. He and his wife had a young child, and they divorced, and they remained very close friends through his entire life. And he said, I'm going to move to New York. And I said, well, that's great, because I was this little younger sister. I said, and he confessed to me that he was gay. And I said, well, tell me, explain to me, because you're just my brother, right? So he said, a gay man can't live life. They have no life because you can't have a job, you can't have a home, you can't have a family, you can't have children. They think that gay men, my brother was very much a family man, and there he was at a Jesuit law school. I want to have a home, a career. I believe in commitment. I believe in family. That's who I am, and I'm going to try to be who I am. Just and he gave me such a pat on the back, because here I thought I was always just this little younger sister, but he'd seen what I'd done in New York, and I said, come, and so he did. He came to New York, and he worked at a very powerful, what would be called in that business, white shoe law firm. And for those of you who ever saw the film Philadelphia, you could have been fired for being a gay man. But he met a business who became his business and lifetime partner, and that was Perry Ellis. So my brother left the law firm and he became president of Perry Ellis, and he helped Perry build the Perry Ellis business. Now, in those days, Perry Ellis was bigger than Ralph Lauren
Yes,
was.
yes, he was.
It was huge. That Perry Ellis was the name. And so, my brother built this idea of Perry's, and he built it into, by the end of his life, which was unfortunately 5 years later, a $750 million business. And New York thrives on the arts and the economy that the arts produces, not only Broadway, but also fashion. So I lived with having these wonderful years with my brother, finally being able to be who he was, because he felt that he was building this business with Perry, and they were committed to each other and bought a home together and had a home, and my brother had joint custody for his daughter, and so Perry was like a stepfather, and Kate, their daughter, spent a great deal of time with them, and they, as my brother would say, he hoped that they were an example of what could be for gay men, even though the government and law had not really caught up. It was starting to catch up really until the AIDS epidemic and the 1980s and the election of Ronald Reagan and the powerful moral majority coming into government.
So we're talking about the 80s.
Yes.
People did not come out as gay in certain industries, white shoe industries, a lawyer. I mean, it just wasn't done because they'd be, as you said, they'd be fired. They were a pariah. There was no way anyone was going to do business. Yet there are certain, whether it be in the, in the arts, it was more accepted.
Yes.
And so your brother moving to New York, meeting Perry Ellis, meeting his life partner, it freed him
Mhm.
from a life he was living that he was hiding from.
Mhm.
And and what a wonderful thing to be for you to be able to be a part of that.
Yes. So what
And
I was going to say is that that is what is so poignant about the early days of AIDS, because people who had finally done something where they could truly be themselves and they were doing beautiful work and good things in the world suddenly were faced with AIDS and
now
what that did.
for the younger generation,
Yes,
AIDS is not the AIDS epidemic is history. Um,
unfortunately.
very unfortunately, and it was something that was so horrific. We didn't know anything about it, and there were so many rumors going around about it, and no one wanted to say they had it. Um, how did you find out? I know your brother told you, but how did he finally tell you that he had it?
Well, first of all, you had mentioned, a younger generation who don't really understand the history of AIDS. And that's part of the reason for writing my book, because I am very worried that this very important piece of history has somehow been brushed over or too easily forgotten. And it's a very important piece of our social and cultural history. So it's very significant to me when I hear that the younger generation sort of takes it for granted that, oh, AIDS is not a very big deal, because it is a very big deal, and
It's a
it was
very big
a very big deal. So my brother, when he discovered that he had AIDS, had to keep it a secret. And it was a very huge, it was basically a death sentence. And he could not tell anybody because the stigma was so great. And he did share it with me and maybe two other people. For me, it was terrifying and awful. And it it was so much to hold that I started journaling constantly, because I had to let it out somehow. And that is a lot about what takes place in my book as well, is in learning how other people suddenly were getting information about this secret and about who else might had have AIDS. But at the time in New York City, um, and because the moral majority had become so prevalent in our society, the Catholic Church passed a law that they could fire anybody that was working with Catholic Charities who was gay. So that immediately put all those men who worked in those industries at risk, because of course if you're not employed you don't have health insurance. So you understand how that the predicament became terrible. So nobody could say anything because so much depended upon it. There were Broadway shows that were in pre-production that suddenly the backers pulled the money out of because they thought, well, we can't go near this. We can't be associated with AIDS or the gay community, and my brother, as he said to me, you must keep this a secret. People, think about this business. Think about how many people we employ, not just here in New York, but all over. They're all going to lose their jobs. They'll lose their jobs immediately. Perry Ellis was publicly traded company. You know, the stakes were enormous for men who found out that they had AIDS, because here they were also at the height of their dreams, and they were doing very big things in New York City and had big businesses, and yet they were going to be condemned, and they were condemned.
They were
Because
condemned. There wasn't they were condemned. They were pariahs. Nobody wanted to go near. We didn't know anything about, there was the thing about, oh, you can't touch someone. You'll get you'll get it if you touch them. I mean, there was, not only were there unknowns, but there was such a fear of getting it, and it was considered a gay man's disease.
Well, our government
Epidemic.
labeled it the gay disease. Ronald Reagan, our president, never mentioned the word AIDS until 1987, when AIDS began in 1981. My brother was diagnosed in 83. Ronald Reagan didn't even mention the word until a year and a half after my brother was dead, and most of my friends were dead. And there had been an epidemic declared in San Francisco, declared an epidemic level. Mayor Koch in New York City would not declare an epidemic level. And so funding decreased in our hospitals. St. Vincent's Hospital, which was the Catholic hospital, was allowed to turn patients away. So hospitals became crowded and overwhelmed because the stigma was so bad. And I was in those hospital corridors. We saw pictures during COVID. We saw pictures on the news of gurneys lining hallways. That's what it looked like, except all those men were alone because they were abandoned by their jobs, by our government, by our health department, and a lot of times, very, very sadly, by their families.
That's very true. And that is one of the reasons why we need to understand that it happened and what happened. I mean, you mentioned the picture of what we saw during COVID of of hospital beds being lined up all over the place, and the thousands and thousands and thousands of people who died. And it's something that we need to understand. We need to remember it, because as we go through other things, they go, nah, this can't happen. Well, yeah, it can. I mean, I remember meeting a little boy. It was probably 1987 when I was living in Denver. I had my son was about 2.5 years old, something like that. There was a little boy riding his bike. He couldn't have been more than 4 or 5. And his parents were trying to get him into kindergarten. They didn't want him there because he had AIDS. Now, how does a little boy get it? He got it through a blood transfusion. And they finally did. I mean, I got on the phone and I was talking to because I couldn't believe it. This poor little kid was being made a pariah when he did nothing wrong.
Nothing.
And we're talking about the 80s.
Mhm.
So your brother tells you this. There's no real information. There's no internet for us to Google.
Nope.
How did you, the question isn't how did you deal with it? How did you put this into your life? How were you able to integrate it on a day-to-day basis? I mean, this information, and as you said, it's, your brother, and then you lost a lot of other people.
You know, you say that and I kind of pause and I think, okay, I believe that my story is important. And the reason why I wanted my story out there is because I was a young woman in her early 30s. I was a dancer on Broadway. And yet I was suddenly in a position where I was taking care of people who were dying. I didn't know anything about death. And I think a lot of young people at that age don't know anything about death or ever expect that there's going to be some kind of a situation where they can really no longer do their job because they have to take care of people who are dying. So that's where I was. And what do you do? I think that I witnessed that a lot of people had different reactions than mine. But my choice was to stand up and to stand up on my own 2 feet and fight it and take care of the people I love and be an advocate for what I believe is right, is to not judge people who are vulnerable, is to be with people when they are dying, because you are never more vulnerable than when you are dying, no matter what you are dying of. I think that any idea that God and religion tells us that somebody is bad and does not deserve our love or compassion, I do not believe that. Yet I stood in a hospital corridor and on the television was Pat Buchanan, the communications director for the White House of the United States of America, who stood there waving his hand. AIDS is God's wrath on the homosexual. That played in hospital corridors as people were dying. And I'm telling you, I witnessed this. A person who had grown up with a military father, who believed in my country, who believed in our institutions. I still believe in my country. I still believe in our institutions, but they were wrong at that point in history, and they were making the wrong decisions. I believe they were cowards. And the one thing I am not is a coward. So that's how I lived my life. I ended up having to leave my show because I couldn't handle it. It was too much for me. But I stayed by my brother and tried to be with him for the last 6 months of his life. And then I did that for Perry. And then I did that for my friends, because that's what was happening. And you can't ignore reality when it is right there in your face. Or at least I will say I was a person who chose not to ignore reality. Again, to stand up, to know what I believed in my own 2 feet, and to call out the people who were judgmental and condemning other people. I don't believe in that. And I think I'm a very spiritual person and a very good person, but I don't believe that that's what we should do with our lives.
Well, um, that brings me to where I'd like you to read part of the epilogue.
The epilogue, sure.
Yes.
So this is the very last couple of pages of my book. The theater district streets around Times Square had always buzzed with the hum of what went on from behind theater walls. The honeycomb of actors, dancers, musicians, and crew warming up, setting up, doing makeup, while outside on the sidewalk, near the larger-than-life pictures on billboards, were the wannabes, hanging about and praying for a chance at being who they knew they could be. By the early 1990s, though, such vitality and hope had fizzled. The energy of the streets now supervised by ghosts. Jimmy Kirkwood and Alvin Ailey having joined the parade in 1989. AIDS growing worse, the list of dead mounting. People I worked with in different shows or television commercials, as well as agents, casting directors, and friends of friends, all gone. Their spirits arriving in droves to linger over Broadway with their unfinishedness and defeat. All of them died stigma deaths, like those of suicides or overdoses, from circumstances that many people judged as the victim's own fault. Social condemnations that deny family and friends permission to experience the madness of grief or the comfort of full burial rituals. Society refuses to acknowledge such deaths as tragedies in the same way it turns out to offer sympathy and condolences when a son dies in a car accident or from an acceptable cancer. The souls I knew had no rest, so Broadway fluttered with a peculiar texture of silence and memory, of things alive but dead. Martin and Tom live forever in the quiet collapse of time and space when theater lights go down and Places is called. I see Laughlin and Perry in the couple living down the street from me, two men with two daughters who have turned their basement into a second-grade classroom for their girls, and several others in the neighborhood creating a safe school pod during the COVID-19 pandemic. Society has changed, I whisper to an immaculate sky. But let no one forget all those men who paid for that good news with their lives. Early on, my brother John said, "Why do you want to write about that?" Because sometimes a story is all that's left. I scavenged for miracles in the patched syllables of words and started to work them the way I'd once worked my body. I knew the trick to balancing in arabesque, that balance is not something you do and hold by freezing in a position. Balance is having the faith to hover, to be suspended in that spot where two equal forces meet to play tug of war, each pulling with all its strength in the opposite directions. I stand now once again with my feet pressed to a singular, tiny mark in the universe, listening for that tinkling of response. Someone saying, "Yes, I feel it too. I know. I know."
Christine, thank you, because that just brings it all together. It's a story, we need to share stories, and stories are meant to be heard. If it's heard by one, if it's heard by two, if it's heard by just one person who tells another person, this is a part of history that cannot be swept under the rug, because we're almost going back in time and stigmatizing people again in trying to delineate who is a person and who isn't. Even as women, people are trying to take away our rights that we fought so hard for. So we have to remember these stories. And I want to thank you for having the courage to tell this story, because it's a very, for you, it's an exceedingly personal story. I know that you left dancing. You told somebody that, what was it? Oh, your secret dream is to be a girl backup singer, really rocking it. I mean, you have that in you, and why not? But in the meantime, you're telling a story that people need to hear, because
Well,
we
thank
cannot
you.
repeat.
Yes.
We cannot keep repeating history. And it's called Third Girl from the Left. And Christine, there you go. Is there, I don't remember, and this is not a good
Yeah,
thing for
sure.
me. Do you have a website? Is there a place that people could find more about you, or just Google Third Girl from the Left?
You can Google Third Girl from the Left. My book is available in bookstores and on Amazon. I also sold the rights to Audible, so you can, get it in an Audible production if you want. I do have a website, but I've launched my career as a writer, and so I'm working on my second book now, which will be fiction. But I am there if people want to get to know me, and they can reach out to me, because there's an address there that they can reach out to. But meanwhile, I'm loving reaching out in this way. And I thank you and so many other female entrepreneurs who have found ways for women to be communicating with each other. I think that is so important to all of us. We tend to get isolated in our lives, but we must be telling our stories and listening to each other.
Well, Christine, as I said, thank you so much for telling your story.
Thank you.
You can find us on all of your popular podcast platforms. And of course, our website, sylviaandme.com. Stay safe, stay healthy, and as always, stay tuned.